Welcome to episode 39 of Gods and Heroes of Ancient Greece. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and today we will continue with the tale of Theseus with the story of Theseus and Phaedra. Theseus had reached the peak and the turning point of his fortunes. It was his attempt to found his happiness solidly at his own hearth, rather than seek it in bold and passing quests, that plunged him into stress and pain. When in the flower of his youth he had stolen Ariadne of Crete from her father, King Minos, her little sister Phaedra had accompanied her. After Dionysus carried off Ariadne, Phaedra, not daring to return to her tyrannical father, had gone to Athens with Theseus. Not until Minos was dead did she return to her home in Crete, and there, in the palace of her brother, Deucalion, the eldest son of King Minos, who now ruled the island, she grew into a beautiful girl and wise. Theseus, who had not remarried after the death of his wife Hippolyta, heard Phaedra's charms praised on all sides, and hoped to find her as charming as his first love, her sister Ariadne. Deucalion, the new king of Crete, favored the hero, and when he returned from the wedding of Thessalian friend Pirithous, at which the blood had flowed so freely, the two kings formed a protective alliance. Theseus then asked Phaedra in marriage, and was not refused. Soon after, he voyaged home with this girl from Crete, who was indeed so like her sister in face and in manner that it seemed to Theseus that the hopes of his youth were being fulfilled in his late manhood. To fill the cup of his happiness, Phaedra bore him 2 sons in the first years of their marriage, Artemis and Demophon. But she was not as virtuous and true-hearted as she was beautiful. Hippolytus, the king's young son, who was of her own age, pleased her better than his aging father. He was the son of Theseus by Hippolyta, the Amazon he had once abducted. The child, Hippolytus, had been sent to Troezen to be reared by the brothers of his father's mother, Athra. When he was grown, this chaste and beautiful youth, who had resolved to dedicate his life to Artemis, the virgin goddess, and who had never even looked at a woman with desire, came to Athens in Eleusis, where he was to take part in the celebration of the mysteries. It was here that Phaedra first saw him. As she looked at Hippolytus, he seemed as though she had before her Theseus as he must have been in his youth. The boy's fair body and innocent spirit kindled her heart, and she desired him. But she locked her passion in her breast and was silent. When the youth left, she had a temple built on the Acropolis at Athens and consecrated to the goddess of love. Standing within it, one could look towards Troezen, so that later it was called the Temple of Aphrodite, who gazes afar. Here she went day after day, looking out to sea. When at long last Theseus journeyed to Troezen to visit his kinsman and his son, she accompanied him and remained there for a long time. At first she fought the fires of love, fled into solitude, and wept out her sorrow under a myrtle tree. But in the end, she confided her trouble to her old nurse, a shrewd but foolish woman who adored her mistress with blind, unreasoning faithfulness, and undertook to inform the youth of his stepmother's passion for him. When Hippolytus received her message, he was filled with repugnance, which turned to loathing. The moment undutiful Phaedra suggested that he thrust his father from the throne and share the rule with her, in the intensity of his disgust, he cursed all women, and it seemed to him that he was defiled by the mere hearing of so guilty a proposal. Since Theseus was at the moment absent from Troezen, an occasion his faithless wife had availed herself of, Hippolytus declared that not for another instant would he remain under the same roof with her. After he had given the nurses his answer, he ran into the open to hunt in the service of his divine mistress Artemis. to live in the forest far from the palace until his father should return, and he could pour out to him his troubled soul. Phaedra found it impossible to endure the rejection of her love and her scheme. Awareness of her fault and unbearable desire warned and warmed within her, but hatred, born of wounded pride, gained the upper hand. When Theseus returned, he found she had hanged herself. Clasped in her right hand was a letter she had written before her death. It read, "Hippolytus had designs upon my honor. There was only one way to escape his pursuing. I die rather than become faithless to my husband." For a long time Theseus stood rooted to the earth in horror and revulsion. At last, his numbness leaving him, he lifted his hands to heaven and he prayed, "Poseidon, Father, you have always loved me as though I were indeed your own son. Once you gave me 3 wishes, which you promised to fulfill. Now I remind you of your pledge. I have only one wish for which I crave fulfillment. Let the sun not set for my son this day." Hardly had he uttered this curse when Hippolytus returned from the hunt and, learning of his father's arrival, entered the palace. He followed the sounds of lament and came into the presence of his father and the body of his stepmother. Gently and calmly he replied to Theseus's accusations. "My conscience is clear," he said. "I myself am guiltless of this crime." But Theseus held out to him his stepmother's letter and sentenced him to exile. Unheard, Hippolytus could only call upon Artemis, his patron goddess, to witness his innocence, and with sighs and tears bid farewell to treason, his adopted country. On the evening of the same day, a messenger came to the palace and said, when he was admitted to the king's presence, "O master and ruler, your son Hippolytus no longer sees the light of day." Theseus received this news coldly and said with a bitter smile, "Was he slain by an enemy whose wife he dishonored just as he wished to do violence in his father's bed?" But the messenger replied, "No, Lord. His own chariot and the curse your lips pronounced have destroyed him." Then Theseus raised his hands to heaven in thanks. "O Poseidon, today you have dealt with me as a true father and heard my prayer. But tell me, messenger, how did my son meet his death? How did the club of reprisal strike this ravisher?" The messenger told his tale. "We were currying the horses of our young master Hippolytus down by the shore of the sea, when we heard of his exile, and soon he himself came accompanied by a group of his childhood friends, all weeping and lamenting, and told us to make ready the chariot for a journey. When all was done, he lifted his hands to heaven and prayed, 'Destroy me, Zeus, if I have been an evildoer, and whether I be dead or alive, let my father discover that he has dishonored me without cause.' Then he took up his goad, leaped into the chariot, seized the reins, and drove towards Argos and Epidaurus, and we accompanied him on his way. We reached the barren coast. To our right lay the sea, and to the left great boulders jutted from the hillside. Suddenly we heard a deep rumble like subterranean thunder. The horses took fright and pointed their ears, while we looked around full of alarm to see where the sound was coming from. When our glance fell on the sea, we beheld a terrible thing, a wave which towered up in the sky and blotted out the view of further shore and the isthmus. White with surf and loud with clamor, this mountain of water made for the very path the horses were traveling, and as it broke, it spewed forth a monster, a gigantic bull, whose roars echoed and re-echoed from the rocks. At sight of him, the horses went wild with terror. Our master, who was skilled in driving, pulled the reins taut with both hands and used them as an experienced helmsman uses his rudder. But the horses had become unmanageable. They champed at the bit and strained away from their driver. Just as they were racing down the level road, the sea monster blocked their course. And when they turned toward the boulders, it crowded them by rushing close to the wheels. This finally forced the chariot onto the rocks. Your unfortunate son plunged headlong, and the horses stormed on in unguided flight, dragging him and the capsized chariot over sand and stones. It all happened so quickly that we could not come to our master's aid. Although he was bruised and half crushed, he still called to his horses, which had always obeyed him, and cried out to the wind his grief at his father's curse. He vanished from our sight around a curve in the path. The sea monster was gone, as if the earth had swallowed it up. And while the other servants breathlessly ran in search of the chariot, I hastened here to tell you of your son's fate. Theseus was silent and stared at the floor. After a time he spoke, and he seemed sad and in doubt. I do not rejoice at his misfortune, and I do not bewail it, he said. But I wish I could have him here alive to question him and talk to him about what he has done. His words were cut short by the screams of an old woman who rushed through the rows of servants, her garment torn, her gray hair disheveled, and threw herself at the king's feet. It was Queen Phaedra's old nurse, whose conscience had begun to prick at her at the rumor of the death of Hippolytus, so that now she could no longer keep silence, but with sobs and cries revealed to the king the innocence of his son and the guilt of her mistress. But the unhappy father could gather his wits. Hippolytus was carried into the palace on a bier and brought before him, shattered, but still breathing. Penitent and despairing, Theseus threw himself over his dying son, who summoned the last shreds of his strength to ask, "Has my innocence been proven?" A nod from one nearby answered his question and gave him comfort. "My father, you were deceived," murmured the youth, and the breath fled from his body. Theseus had him buried under the same myrtle where Phaedra had once striven with her love. Often her fingers, restless with passion, had pulled at its branches and crumpled the glossy green leaves. Since this had been her favorite place, she too was buried there and allowed to remain, for the king did not wish to dishonor his wife in death. And here ends my tale for today. But I'll be back with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends, enjoy the journey.